The first generation of comic books were writing the rules as it happened. And you didn't have the protection of things like child labor laws, and any publisher who could get printing time and paper was putting out comic books because they were cheap and they were easy to produce. But it also meant tremendous opportunity for people. And obviously the guy we're honoring today, Joe Kubert, started when he was about 12 or 13 because he could walk in the door and get some work. It was erasing pages and maybe, spotting blacks on pages, but he was there learning at the hands and feet of the talent putting out the pages at the time. And that was a tremendous learning environment for him. And he came to it with all these natural talents that were encouraged and honed and developed until he was doing his own writing and drawing, largely for DC in the later 40s, with Frank Giacoya and Carmine Infantino, was that almost immediate next generation of talent getting work. And Joe then went on to do just about everything you could imagine short of stapling the books themselves. He was a technical innovator with the 3D stuff with his partner Norm Maurer. He was a penciler, he was an inker, he became a writer and an editor. Practically a publisher with the work he did with the Army, with PS Magazine, and most importantly, as an editor and then later on his own as a teacher, educated countless writers, artists, colorists, creators. He has left a vast imprint on this field, and his loss is a particularly heartfelt one across the field, which is why we're honoring him today, and that's why this room should be packed. Quickly, on my immediate far left, I should say, is Paul Levitz, who worked with Joe for countless years at DC in various capacities. My immediate left, Tom Raney, artist who was one of the Kubert students. To my immediate right, Tim Truman from an early generation of students. And to his right, Thom Zahler, another student and graduate. And let's talk about Joe. When did you first become aware of his work?
For me, he was one of the first artists I could identify. He had a very distinctive signature, a very distinctive inking style. But I noticed him mostly in Dynamite magazine because he did a how to draw column. Well, the Kubert students did the Dynamite duo for a while, and then he did a how to draw column. And you saw that his school was mentioned back in the days when they had letter columns. It took about 5 months to get letters in to print them, so they would run biographies of the artists. And I started seeing how many of them went to this place called the Kubert School. And I said, I gotta know about that. I think that's where I want to go. And that's where I first started finding out about him in his columns about drawing, and then covers of All-Star Squadron, and that's where I got him.
Tim?
In 1962, on my first day of first grade, in West Virginia we didn't have kindergarten and all that stuff, and so I was walking to my first grade class with my dad, like crying my eyes out in Dunbar, West Virginia. And we walked by this barber shop, and sitting in the window, the barber shops used to have comic books for the kids, and sitting in the window was this it was Our Fighting Forces comic. And I stopped and looked at the comic, and Dad must have taken note of that. And then we walked on to school, and I had a horrible first day of school. And when I came home, Dad had gone to that barbershop and he'd somehow talked the barber out of that issue of Our Fighting Forces. And I looked on the cover, and Joe was one of the few guys who would sign his work, particularly at that time. It was Joe Kubert. I just totally fell in love with his work. And my cousins had comic book collections, and every time I would notice I was particularly attracted to this guy. So through the years, Joe and Frank Frazetta were like my favorite artists growing up, and I always connected their work somehow because there always just seemed to be this it was veiny and tough and very visceral. And I just had this huge connection to it. And I could always tell exactly what was going on in the story. And his characters always seemed to have this really, they were very emotive. You could tell what they were thinking. And so he was my favorite artist. When I was growing up, and then when I had the chance to go to the school, I was awed by the man, because he had been one of my artistic fathers. So that's pretty much the genesis of of the whole situation.
Tom?
My story's not quite as large.
So,
When I was a kid, we didn't have a whole lot of money, and all my comics were secondhand. So my introduction was Sergeant Rock, and I wasn't a big war guy. I was more a superhero, fan. But he made me want to read them. And aside from that, just the house ads.
Okay.
The wonderful house ads that he did. Again, made me sit there and go, "Well, I wish I could get my hands on those."
And Paul?
I was also a superhero kid, so I hadn't seen a lot of Joe's work in my earliest years. That's on the newsstand, obviously, without getting pulled away from my quest to get everything that had a Superman S on it. But around the time Carmine became in charge of the covers, he began occasionally using Joe for assignments Joe had never done on covers before. A Batman cover, a Justice League cover. And I very vividly remember seeing those, and that doesn't look like it usually does. It's kind of cool and different, and being very pleasantly confused by it. And the first time I think I was really aware of Joe in terms of the breadth of what he'd done was the DC special that he did, introducing himself. It was DC Special 5 in '68, maybe. And he did 5 or 6 pages, a frame for introducing his kids. Little Andy, little Adam.
Oh my God.
That probably continue to embarrass them to this day. And self-portraiture of himself at the board, and a wealth of the material that he'd done in the course of his career. By then I was starting to collect back issues and find things like his Hawkman work and his showcase work and all the wonderful and strange stuff that he touched, and learning the joy of his art. And then it was a whole different phenomenon to finally meet him when I was hanging around DC doing the fanzines. And here I'm a little 14-year-old kid, the age, literally the age of his children. And he's putting up with me and giving me all this information. And he's about to start doing Tarzan, and that's going to be so cool. He's looking forward to it. And this really big man with this really strong handshake on my little tiny wee hand. And he still kept doing that to me all the years. It's only like in the last year that I could finally shake his hand without taking an ibuprofen afterwards.
So, let's stay with you for a second. When you joined staff at DC and were learning how to be an editor, working with Joe Orlando, Joe was editing war books at the time, right? Or was had he stopped?
Joe had, when I went on staff, I think Joe still had our Army at War, but I think he'd given up the other war books at that point.
Right.
So he was coming in still on a semi-regular basis.
He was coming in a couple days a week, usually.
Now, these guys learned from him in a vastly different way, but what would you say you learned from him, seeing him package his books?
I think what I learned watching Joe, a couple of things. One of the ways that he was ahead of his time, which maybe isn't where we're happiest that the industry went over the years, but he was the first creator in the DC system, and I think this was true at the other major publishers. They would think they were very similar, to break the dynamic of how fast a book could be produced. When he was doing Tarzan, the DC system at the time, you had to have your book finished roughly 8 to 10 weeks before it was going to be shipped out. Several of those weeks consisting of, it sits around the production department for them to decide to get in the mood to do the minor corrections that need to be made on it. And Joe was determined to do Tarzan as a work of art. This was an enormously committed project for him. And he was pushing the limits. And he peaked on it, I think, with a Tarzan that turned in coloring, color separation, and printing in a week, which was insanely unheard of at the time, but sort of showed that, really, we can do this when we need to. You can make the system work in an unconventional way to achieve your goals. So I think that was certainly one of the things I learned from him. The other, which was useless to me as an individual, but was fascinating to me as an editor, was the power of a thumbnail. In the years I was working on editorial staff, Joe was doing a number of books that were being finished by the Filipinos, and he would compose the entire goddamn thing about this paper. There was a particularly fascinating moment. If you read Joe's interviews, he talks about having learned to draw on butcher paper. His dad was a butcher. Dad would let him have some paper off the roll, and he'd scribble on that. Well, even as an adult, I think he was very conservative about using paper. And when I became responsible for the editorial inventory of the company, keeping track of the stuff, I was doing sort of the first marrying the numbers to the inventory items. And I found paper bags. And Joe had turned in a paper bag as a complete script and pencils. And it was. It wasn't any use to any other human being in the world, but every bit of the thinking was laid perfectly in place in these tiny little thumbnails and these little indications, and you could see the strength of the composition and the strength of the logic. It was an interesting accounting discussion, but fascinating from a creative standpoint to see sort of how you could do the homeopathic solution of a comic book and reduce it down to its absolute essence.
Okay, now Tim, you were one of the first generation. First
Third
generation?
year, third year the school started. Yeah.
All right, so Joe was probably a lot more hands-on than he was later. What was it like learning from him? And how did he teach?
Joe was the most, I've met a lot of people. Joe was one of the most king-like individuals I've ever encountered. He had, especially when you're younger, like I was 19, 20 years old, and I was in the presence of a guy whose name I'd only known as a signature in his books, but he just had a way of, when you had a critique under one of Joe's classes, you weren't afraid of failing. You were like, it was more of a sense that you were going to disappoint Joe. And these guys, I'm sure will know what I'm talking about because this is sort of legendary, but the last thing you wanted to hear whenever Joe was standing over your shoulder looking down at your board, I mean, we had a great system where we worked 8 hours a day at our boards, and the teachers would come around and check out what we were doing, give us individual critiques. And the last thing you wanted to hear when you were aware of this presence standing beside you, because he was a big guy, he worked out a lot, and his hands were like, to shake hands with him, it was like sticking your hand into a barrel, and then having to crush you. But the last thing you wanted to hear was Joe go, it was like this sigh. And I've since been able to figure out that he was trying to figure out how to tell you what to do without crushing you too badly. And another thing was that Joe admitted this himself, was that he had never did everything by gut instinct and had been doing it that way since he was 12 years old. And especially in those early years of the school, when you would ask him questions or when he was trying to think of ways to help you approach a problem, he didn't really know why he did what he did. So he would have to self-analyze, his own style and in order to be able to help you advance. And so that was some of my main impressions of being tutored by him. But just that king-like presence is always will loom large. I'm sorry.
Was he looming large over you?
Very much so.
And what sort of, how did he, years later, had he finally managed a way to articulate more readily?
I'd add on to what Tim was saying, that it didn't seem to me so much that he didn't know how to express what he knew. He didn't know how to express it verbally. But
That's
in 10 seconds,
he'd
he'd throw a piece of tracing paper over it, and it would be done. Before you could see him move his hand.
Yeah.
And also with the side, you always heard sandpaper, because he'd sit there and go, while he's thinking about what can I even say or do to get this through to him.
So did you measure your progress in the decreasing number of size?
Yeah, I think
The
so.
long length of the side.
I mean, we had guys in the class that how Joe did it and what he did was obviously not anything of interest to them. But he was one of the only teachers in the school that got them to pay attention and got them to listen.
Now, when he put the tracing paper over and quickly showed you how to be done, did he then talk you through it, or did he leave it for you to analyze on your own?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
But it was the physical expression of it, I think, that really got it over for people. Because we all think visually, as the people that were going to the school. So I think that was the best way for us to learn it.
I mean, one of the things I'd say, sort of broadening out from Joe the individual to the teaching method of the time, it's hard to explain to the current generation of kids coming into comics what it was like at that period when you were working. You had Kubert in one office, Orlando in another, depending on the time, Giordano in another, Ramita over at Marvel. You had these guys, and everybody brought their work in physically. Mm-hmm. And you brought your work in, and they sat there, and they pulled out the tracing paper pad. And as a non-artist, it was fascinating to watch the power of the teaching, because you could literally see the light bulbs go off in the young artists' heads. There is Joe Orlando, who was the one who taught me the most, because I was his specific assistant, taught me tricks for editing art for the art blind that I still sit there and I work with artists and explain stuff. But there are these amazing things that when you actually show the artist, the hand fits this way. You literally watch these young people who have been trying to puzzle the world out, I guess is the only way to describe it as a non-artist, and it instantly seems to make sense, and they leap ahead, many of them a whole stage in their drawing at that moment, because there's a clarity the way those guys could lay it out based on the years of experience.
Yeah, I mean, my days as an editor, it was great having Dick in place, because we had somebody who was an artist, and a respected artist at that, so that you had a go-to guy to bring talent in and go, something's wrong here, I don't have the training to articulate it, Dick, what is it? And he instantly saw what I was talking about and could explain that. And Ramita at Marvel was the same way. And today everyone is digital and everyone's scattered across the world, and I think that kind of teaching is tougher to do now.
Yeah.
So it's lost.
Dick was one of our instructors, Giordano.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You can learn more in 10 minutes from him than most instructors in an hour.
Tom, what were the size like for you?
The size?
The size from Joe's side of your room.
Well, I didn't hear him that much. I was doing well.
Whatever.
I still have some of the tracing paper overlays that he did for me. You didn't so much talk to Joe as he had an audience. The thing I took away the most, though, is that when you go to school and you're that age, you think you know more than you do. And there's a lot of stuff that Joe taught that we're like, I don't know that he knows what year it is anymore. He had us doing like dummy books of comics where you put together samples, like entire pages. He taught us how to do everything. He wanted you to be, if you went into a one-horse town, you would be the artist who could get the job. So we learned how to pencil, we learned how to ink, we learned how to letter, how to color, how to do paste ups. We learned how to do color separations. And because he was Joe, you went along with it. You know, saying no, and that wasn't an option. And that training has come to help me so much more.
Well, unlike these guys, you certainly are using those disciplines today. Right?
Yeah,
You're lettering some books and producing others. And
yeah, the book I do, Love and Capes, I do the entire book top to bottom.
right, but you're also doing
Yeah,
pieces of that for other people.
right. He taught us how to do everything, and it's been so invaluable because I'm the only person I know who will work for my own crappy grades. But as a creator, it's so freeing not to go, I don't need to hire a colorist, I can do that. And to be able to think in that production way. I mean, I can still think in CMYK separations. And so many people who work on computers these days, they're seeing the finished product, but it's kind of like math class where your teacher asks you to show your work and they're missing the step that they're skipping.
Right.
And it's so much better for production to be able to think in those terms.
Okay.
Even
Now,
if you're not going to be doing it,
Well, I was about to- now,
it was
Tom.
good to understand.
you've been predominantly a penciler since you graduated, but knowing all of those other elements, has that helped you when you actually get an assignment and then think about how you're going to draw the story?
Yeah, it's always in place. And actually, the first work that I had was assistant work, inking backgrounds and stuff. And I did color separations by hand for Murphy Anderson. So,
Really? I forgot that.
yeah, well, it was before you met.
And it's, when you learn to letter as a penciler, you learn to leave space for dialogue.
Yeah.
In a way that a lot of people
It
don't.
puts in your head
Yeah.
that automatic space that needs to be left.
Now, when Joe began the school in the 76, 77?
76.
Yeah. One of the deals he cut with DC was that the students would have space in the back of our Army of War for the backup stories as a place for their craft to be seen and a working laboratory. Tim, you were among the first for that. What was it like actually producing something knowing it was going to see print?
No, it was terrifying, but Joe did it. I mean, Joe did it too so that we would have a learning experience because he knew that there was no other way to show you how to improve and what your work lacked and what was needed for the comic book page other than to see your work actually reproduced on that comic page. And we didn't make much money doing it, but a lot of times Joe would have to go in and finesse stuff in order to bring it up to professional standards. And the first job I actually did was he had a junior scholastic account, and I did I turned in some homework. I had the flu one time, and I turned in some homework and let a buddy bring it in to class. And Joe really liked the page that I turned in for his class, so he sent a note back with the buddy. Says I want to talk to you about doing a scholastic fill-in. And I was like, oh my God, it was like that was my first job. I felt like I finally made it, and so I did the work. And in the end, Joe paced it up, and I mean, it was a Joe Kubert. It was a Joe Kubert production. By the time I was done, because I failed so miserably. But Joe didn't really hold it against me or anything.
Just wondering, in those cases, did Joe provide you instructions? This is where you stopped up, and then this is the finished work with that he then made it publishable.
No, usually
the
we only do
teaching
it
experience
when
or
it was
something like
published. That's when you saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it could be. It was just a little embarrassing, really, but it really made you want to work harder because you kind of felt bad that Joe had to redraw so much stuff. I mean, he didn't make you feel like a heel or a failure. he would encourage you to keep on doing it in his own way. He wasn't like, hey, buddy, except some of the students had, or graduate students had that relationship with him, like Bassett and Veach and those guys who were just like on some kind of level that was beyond our comprehension. They could be buddies with Joe, but so he would never. He just, it's hard to describe. He just had this way of, I didn't do as good a job as I could have, and but you didn't feel like, oh, I'm going to quit. You felt like, man, the next time.
Joe,
exactly
That was big with him also, next time.
Yeah.
You messed up now, don't mess up next time.
He'd been there, man. He was working when he was 12 and 13 years old. Now I remember that first job, the first Scholastic job I turned in, there was this beautiful, on butcher paper, beautiful little sketch on the wall. It was very primitive, and it was of a rabbi. And I said, Joe, who's that? And he said, oh, that's my grandfather. I drew that when I was 12. And I was very touched by it. His grandfather was a rabbi. Somehow it was a very touching moment. You got to see this. It was in Joe's studio. And you got to see this private side of his personal family world that you weren't aware of when you were, in the schools. Anyway, that's just an anecdote.
Well, Joe, to his credit, got a number of commercial accounts. The PS Preventative Service magazine for good government, but there was a fair number of commercial
Heroes World.
The Heroes World ads. Yeah.
No, but I read those.
Those are amazing
Talk about
incubators. Well, we had to put the Heroes World catalog whenever Heroes World.
They were a distributor pre-Diamond.
Yeah, and at that point,
also a retailer. I mean,
at that point they were a retailer.
They had a big mail order business.
Yeah, exactly.
And they had toys, and they had.
And they would put this comic book catalog together, and instead of taking photographs of all the items, the idea was to make it look like a comic book. So we students would draw, little Star Wars fighters and all that, all this stuff. There'd be like 12 of them on a page, and Joe would sometimes lay out the pages for us, and we'd have to, fill in with these intricate little drawings that was all hand lettered. And that was just this incredible incubator for hands-on commercial art, production line comics. And there would be like 12 of us working on it in this little upstairs room in downtown Dover that Joe had rented specifically for that purpose. And that was, like I say, that was a real learning experience. And then, we'd get to see the stuff in print again and say, oh man, that line sucks, and you can't, that face looks like a blob, and oh, Joe had to redraw this, or oh, each had to redraw that, And so that was a very interesting experience for us.
That reminded me that you guys were, I don't remember if it was your cohort or whether it was Bassett and Veach, but on probably the most unique comic book of the newsstand era. World Color Press was celebrating its anniversary, and they wanted basically a custom publication to give out for the occasion. And it's the only original comic book that featured all of the major publishers' characters. So you have Superman, and Batman, and Spider-Man, and Archie, and Richie Rich, all in conversation with each other. Only, I don't think the Gold Key guys participated, but everybody else's characters were in there interacting and showing off the press and this and that.
Wow. I want to see this.
It was very cool and very strange.
Yeah. Cool projects. He did some great stuff with students for United States Army. Those are great to look at. And that a buddy of mine found was was in an old National Guard armory that they were dismantling, and he found like boxes and boxes of these things. And Joe did a lot of the drawing in this, but of these Armed Forces comics.
I mean, to his credit, drawing the war stories through the 50s into the 60s and then editing the books, getting the armory right, getting the rifles and the tanks, the airplanes. I mean,
Pre-Google.
Yeah, pre-Google. I mean, you would have these huge libraries of photo and art reference books to do all of this, and specifically to the war stuff. Joe had to keep up with what was being used in whatever the conflict was, and insisted the people he hired also have that same fidelity to accuracy. which is another lesson. Subtle, but an important one, because you read the war stories, you wanted to believe it was an accurate circumstance.
Swipe files, cataloged by airplanes, guns, horses, huge file cabinets full of this stuff.
Now, a lot of...
While we're on what you just said about the war, though, I'll tell a fast story about the Thom Zahler book. Shows one of the truly amazing things about Joe was the level of creative passion he had in his 80s. We've had other artists who kept on working for many years, but most of them kind of froze in style and time. Joe and Will Eisner are really the two extraordinary exceptions who kept challenging themselves. So Joe gets a phone call one day from someone. You used to draw that Green Berets newspaper strip in the 60s. Yeah. Do you have any of the original sales brochures that the syndicate used to sell it? I don't know, maybe one of them's around here somewhere. Why? Well, I was the model for one of the Marines in it. Oh, that's neat. And he strikes up a friendship with the guy. Finds the brochure, of course. And it turns out the guy ended up being the military historian for his unit and has this humongous body of information on this important battle in the Vietnam War called Don Sai and how the unit performed it. Well, a normal, rational human being would say, yeah, that's neat. Let's have lunch sometime. You can tell me the story. Joe dove in and he drives down, I forget where it was, North Carolina, maybe Camp Lejeune or something like that. Meet with the guy, hang out, starts digging through it. You wouldn't believe all this stuff. He's come back like a little kid. Yeah. He's found all this stuff. He's found all this history. They've got, every bit of the battles documented. They've got pictures of all the landscape and the ground. And he's like, I gotta do this as a book. And he dives into this work to tell other people's story, tell it exactly right, as a piece of military history. And I've never seen anything like that from an artist remotely of that age and that circumstance. The level of difficulty you're talking about, the economic commitment you're making in terms of your time and energy to get that right, it's just, this exists, it's a story that should be told. And just the little kid's-like excitement about finding this treasure trove of fact he could use to base his material on was so cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that there's all this work Joe has done through the years that hasn't always made it to the United States. So there's still Joe stories to be discovered. I think in the 90s, some of that, the Abraham Stone and some of the others finally saw print in the United States. But I was in Spain a couple of years ago, and my host at the time pulled out this thick Italian Western collection text. Thank you. And there's this long story Joe drew. I couldn't read it, but boy, I could follow along. And it was like, I want to read this. Somebody translate this for me.
200-300 pages worth of stuff.
Yeah, it's just incredible.
Even the stuff here in the States. I mean, I get a call 20 years ago from the Chabad movement. They do a kids magazine and they want to have some comics done. That can I help them with that? At these stations? No. There's no way for the company. We're a business part of the corporation. There's no way really to make any money doing something like that. And it's a little odd to get into religious issues from a corporate standpoint. But I sent him to Joe. And he ends up doing that, 10 years, maybe more, of a regular strip of the adventures of two young kids. And according to, there was a lovely article on the Chabad website after he passed, where the rabbis would work. I said, he used to debate all of, not so much the theology, but the moral missions and how we best tell the story. He wasn't just taking the script and rolling with it. And, I don't think nobody outside the Hasidic Jewish community has seen any of that stuff, maybe 2 panels.
I wasn't aware.
Yeah.
But it rolled on for ages.
But interestingly, going from the picture of his grandfather to that story, then there was the Ossel graphic novel, which from a graphic standpoint, it looked like it was mostly charcoal and pencil work, which was an interesting change for someone who usually does pen and ink. So as he was producing graphic novel after graphic novel, it wasn't the same. The subject matter differed, the presentation differed.
He was very into that. He would learn as he went. It's one of the first guys to start using the European blue line process for coloring. He said he'd seen that at conventions.
I'm told that literally in the hospital, on what turned out to be his deathbed, I don't know what the right term for it is, but there's the next step from the tablet, where now you draw on the screen itself and you see the line weight.
The Satik.
He was learning how to use a Satik on his hospital bed.
Yeah, he never stopped with that.
I can't figure out how to make an iPod work.
Now, let me step aside from Joe for a second, since we're talking about Joe the teacher and the schooling that you guys went through. I want to take a moment, to have you guys reflect on Muriel, his wife's role in all this, because she helped build the school with Joe and helped make it run. Were you guys, working with her at all in any way, or was she a presence there?
No, she was there when I was there, but she wasn't. It was more Debbie who was running things. Debbie and Mike Chen.
But Muriel helped make this happen, right? Joe's
Absolutely. I mean, the stories you hear about Muriel are mostly from the first generation kids.
Okay.
I knew her well. Yeah, she was like our mother.
Okay.
We were at the old Harry Chesler mansion. Harry, and it's an interesting circle because Harry Chesler was the guy who'd given Joe his break. Joe had somehow obtained this mansion on a hill in Dover, New Jersey, from Harry Chesler, and the place had a coach house and all this stuff. It was a rundown old mansion, but so it was this full circle. We were, just that connection with Chesler was pretty interesting. And Muriel was in the office every day, and I imagine, we got there at like 7:30 or 8, and I'm sure Muriel would get there at 6, and she just absolutely became like this mother figure to us. Any small problem we had, over apartments or how the applications for the student loans going, just anything like that, she would assist us with. Guys would have trouble with landlords downtown, and for some reason they couldn't confide in their mothers. They would, immediately run to Muriel and gee, Muriel, what do I do? And she'd always have great suggestions. And being young and jaded and not wise in the world, sometimes we would get this impression that, Muriel was some sort of bean counter, where she had her eye on the dollar. But when you grow up, you realize, well, that's very important for a corporation to have. And when you reflect back on all the advice that she had for us and how she was always there for us, it was, kind of realize what a significant part she was of that entire process. And her and Joe are just absolutely, they're very much in love, She was
real partners.
Yeah, he was different after she passed.
Yeah.
Sure.
Understandable.
Big void. I mean. Now, when you guys graduated and started doing your own work, wherever it was, did you come across situations where you had to turn back to Joe and get some advice? Was he there for you guys after the fact, or was it just alumni, hail fellow, well met?
I never went back to Joe. I went back to a lot of the people I went to school with, and we became a network. The people I went to school with are like war buddies. Mm-hmm. We still talk, and because it's such a machine to go through. When I went, it was 3 years. You had 10 classes a week, 2 classes a day. Everyone had an assignment. By the time you went home for Thanksgiving, you did 100 projects. So once you did that, deadlines didn't scare you. I went to work at a newspaper which put out daily, and I'm like, this isn't going to bother me at all. I didn't see Joe again until It was actually here a couple of years ago. And Joe had so many students that I didn't expect him to remember me, and he didn't. But I went up to him, and there's this thing that happens when you get out of college or art school, and the life you have is not the life you expected when you get out, and you have this whole like cognitive dissonance where you're upset at the education, like, oh, I managed to make it work, but if you'd done this differently, if you'd had computers in the school when I was there, I would have learned more and I would have learned faster. A lot of that had passed away, and I talked to Joe and I said, I was one of your students, and his first question, he got to this, I don't quite know how to describe it. It wasn't quite concerned, but he's like, "Are you making a living as an artist?" I'm like, "Yeah, this is my book over here. I've been on my own for 10 years. I don't have a day job. I'm just a cartoonist now." And there was this look on his face. He was so proud that the education he gave was being used, that he gave you the tools to keep doing what he wanted. And all of the stuff about the school, and because there's all that goofy stuff about paying tuition, and the windows were drafty, and the mansion. Where he went to school, that was my dorm. And it had a lighting board from 1803. You couldn't have two people use a hairdryer on the same circuit without blowing the power, which was important because my room had single pane windows, and we had to heat shrink the windows ourselves over the winter to make sure we didn't freeze. All that passed away, and it was, I don't know if it's like a father-son moment, but it was just this really warm experience where I'm glad I had that moment with him.
Now, Tom, you and I had the pleasure of spending several days with Joe in Spain at a convention a couple of years ago. What was that like hanging out with the teacher again?
It was great. I mean, I've still been seeing Joe every once in a while over the years. So he still remembers me because of that, I think. And he always remembered my wife because she was a student there as well.
Right.
And she's much more interesting than me. But
cuter.
See? I think that's half
No.
the reason I got work.
No, but I mean, being with him, it was more on a peer level at that point.
Yeah,
That must have been an interesting dynamic.
And you could tell that he was pleased by the people that have come through the school and been successful. The number of people that actually end up staying in the field is very small over the years. So he remembers. People remembered due to that, I'm sure. But it was great just to just hang out with him.
Yeah, I was a difficult student. I was very hard-headed. I used to have these incredible arguments with Robert Kanigher when he was there, and I would walk out of his class, and Kanigher would call me an asshole, And I was also very left-wing. Joe was very conservative, and I said something really very stupid to him after President Reagan was shot, that somebody should have shot me. And but there was always this, Joe, I'm pleased to think that Joe thought I was a talent worth fostering in some way, putting up with my bullshit. And so when I left the school, it was very much, it was kind of like leaving home and you don't want to see the old man again. You just want to get out on your own and make your mark and see if you can do it on your own. And I didn't look at Joe's comics. I mean, which was an incredible thing for me because he'd been such an influence. But I consciously didn't look at his comics for a few years, just because my style was so similar. I kind of, I had stylisms that were similar to his, and I wanted to get away from that. So after I became a professional, there was this convention in somewhere down in North Carolina, I believe. But we were at the convention together, and that was when it was just it was like the return of the prodigal, after so long, and we were just very glad to see each other. And I remember sitting on the couch in the lobby, like having real heart-to-heart talks with Joe about the business and the importance of taking care of yourself, and because Joe was very much into working out, keeping himself healthy. As is obvious, he was drawing until probably his last day in the hospital. Literally, so I know that for a fact. And so it's nice to have that kind of one-on-one with you, but I never, So anyway, that's for whatever the hell that's worth is. That was my experience.
You mentioned the stylistic. I mean, early on, a lot of the people coming out were drawing in a Joe style without aping him exactly. But was he fostering your own style to come through, or was it everything the Kubert way?
That was, the students were doing that to their own style.
Okay.
And we were, I was particularly conscious of it because Joe had been an influence on me.
Right.
And I had sat down when I was 12 years old copying his panels out of comics. Mm-hmm. And he was very intrinsic of my own style. But there was actually a stigma about the students when I graduated. The school, becoming a Kubert student became a very respected thing, I believe. But in the old days, there was a bit of a stigma when we'd go up to like the Marvel offices or the DC offices, and especially Marvel, where they would have a bullpen, it'd be like, oh, here come those cubies, and being a cubie was kind of like, oh, here's this whole new. There were only 12 people in my graduating class, and I was the only one that ever, in that class that really got, had a professional comics career. But there was just this stigma that Joe was going to flood the market with these, with these Filipino-like, students, and there's this whole stigma about the whole thing where we were going to take jobs away from the old pros, which never materialized.
I think there's another piece to this too, Tim. I think that's all correct. But I think the other piece that's worth talking about, Joe grew up in a time when most of the comic publishers had something resembling a house style.
Yeah.
And DC's was dominated by Cy Barry's look, and even guys like Joe were being nudged to work closer to that. And when he launched the school, he still really, I think, had the model in his head that the best thing that he could do for the students was to enable them to adapt to the house styles that were out there. I remember giving a speech out there, I have no memory of what year it is anymore, to the assembled students, where I started talking about the rising importance of personal style and the personal artistic language as we were moving towards the differences in the comic book business. And talking with Joe about that, and that was at a time, that was a challenging change for him, because he understood better how to teach people how to do something. I know this is saleable. I know you can make a living if you do this set of tricks, to the more James Stern, CCA kind of, come here and find yourself as a cartoonist. That was not as natural for him, for himself as an artist as well. It was that what he did in his later years with the graphic novels, I think, surprised him as well as surprising everyone. And that was a wonderful transition to see the school make.
Mark Wade and I were talking yesterday about the fact that within the first 24 hours of the news that Joe had left us, a recurring theme on Twitter and Facebook elsewhere was that tomorrow I have to work a little bit harder. We're down to our last couple of minutes. Let me just ask you guys, what do you think Joe's lasting legacy is going to be to yourselves and to the field?
To me, his business model and the way he thought things through was almost more important than his drawing style, because he found a way to work for comic companies and then own his own characters and to publish graphic novels, and he was always way ahead of the curve with that. He taught me to be a better businessman and to run it like a business and hit your deadlines and find new avenues and new places to apply my craft, and not just try to draw Superman as much as I want to do that, but to do new things and find new expressions. And being able to hit deadlines and treating it like a business. I had the Geek magazine ask me to write an article on Joe after he passed, and my first question was, what does it pay? Because Joe would want, Joe taught you to get paid. It was practical. You weren't just in it for the art. You were doing this to make money, put food on the table, and that kind of, when you go into a school like that, you have all those feelings about how you want to do the craft, and you want to do the art, and you want to tell these great stories. And Joe appreciated that, but he also let you know, yeah, but you need to buy food too.
Well, just being in the school in general, there are all these other people that came into play too, Bob Oxner and John Belfi, and John taught me this technique, man, that really came in handy for me was when you go in with a job, like you get a job from somebody, you go in with a job, always complete the job, but always bring them back a second piece, an idea for a new project. It's kind of like make your own work as you go. And John told me that. Joe was very, he kind of reinforced that. One of the big, of course, storytelling was Joe's biggest influence on most of us. That you just tell the story, make sure that your reader can tell the hell what's going on. And then for my own work, because I've done so much historical work, Joe specifically taught me how to reference stuff and the importance of reference. That if you're presenting some sort of historical drama, or even if you're doing like an urban story, or something taking place in the city, but particularly on military stuff and historical stuff, you have a lot of experts out there, and you want to make them believe the story. And the first time you get something wrong in that story, if you draw a gun wrong, if you draw a landing craft wrong, if you draw an airplane wrong, and you have somebody out there who knows a little bit about that stuff, some vet or whatever, or some historian, the first time they see you blow it in your story, they won't believe the rest of the story. So that's really important. So when I did stuff like wilderness and all that, the historical accuracy in there was directly influenced by Joe and the stories he tells.
All right, Tom?
I'd say the big thing try to take from him for the rest of my life, hopefully, is how lucky we are to be able to do the type of job that we want to do. Not many people get to choose specifically, what they want to do. And many of us chose that when we were 10. This is the only thing I ever wanted to do. So.
Paul?
I think what Tom said is exactly where Joe would like to close it. He was so energetic about saying I'm the luckiest guy around.
Yeah.
And with that, I thank you all for being here and joining us, and enjoy the rest of the show. Stay after the jerk shot? Sure. Together? Yeah.
We're working on it, Chief.
Pretend you like each other. We do like each other.
Good for you.
It's an odd bunch.
Stay there, just in case.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I like.
Thanks, guys.
Just let my daughter grab one.
You want to get some center?
Great, thanks, guys. Thank you. Thank you.